At least initially, I'm going to give you a very American talk. I'm going to be talking about issues that are raised in the book, Conscience of a Liberal, which is very much a U.S. story, but obviously, since all the world has its eyes on America now, I think it won't be too irrelevant. And then when we get to the questions, I'm sure that more European issues will come up. So let me give you first the origins of the title of Conscience of a Liberal. You should know that that is a reference to a book published almost 50 years ago in the United States called The Conscience of a Conservative by Barry Goldwater. That book is often taken to be the origin, the start of a movement that ended up dominating U.S. politics, that reached its first pinnacle under Ronald Reagan, and then reached its full control of U.S. government for most of the last 8 years in the United States. And the illusion, although I'm not an admirer of Goldwater's ideas, I do admire the success of the movement that he led. And so this was, my hope was that we could have a real reversal of direction now, a movement that is liberal in the U.S. sense. Of course, I guess everybody here knows liberal in the United States means more or less what social democratic does in Europe. And in order to explain where that was coming from, and now what we might hope for, perhaps expect from Obama, I need to give you a brief history of the last 80 years of the United States. So we have 3 or 4 hours, right? I'll just let's talk a little bit about the political economy. So if you go back 80 years in the United States, we were a radically unequal society. We may have at least notionally had a democratic political system, but the distribution of wealth, the distribution of opportunity was extremely unequal. It was, we use the phrase the Gilded Age to describe the highly unequal society of the late 19th century, and it's often held that things changed at some point in the 20th century, but the truth is, if you look at the actual, as best we can estimate the numbers and the sense of inequality, the Gilded Age continued right up into 1929 and the coming of the Great Depression. Extreme inequality. You might ask, oh, that inequality pretty much unmitigated by any kind of welfare state. Even by the standards of the 1920s, the United States was lacking. We did not have any kind of retirement insurance. We did not have any kind of health guarantees. We were even less efforts to help the less fortunate than you would have found, for example, in Britain or France at the same time. Politically, that highly conservative political system, that highly conservative economic system was supported politically largely because the people who might have protested against it were divided. We were a nation in which the farmers didn't trust the urban working class, in which the immigrants, the children of immigrants, weren't trusted by the children of people whose families had been in the United States for a longer period, and perhaps above all, in which white people and black people were unable to make common cause. And so we had a system of a fragmented, you might say a fragmented working class, while at the same time we had this extreme inequality, extreme privilege at the very top. What shook that system up, there were intimations of reform, that we were gradually changing as a country. What shook it up, however, what really made the change was the Great Depression. So we had the extreme depression, and we had a new government, the New Deal, came into power, and tried, first of all, to achieve recovery from the Depression, which took a long time, did a number of reforms, and remarkably presided over a transformation of our society. In 1929, we were Gilded Age, extreme inequality. Arguably, hard to tell over the chaos of the Depression, but even in 1935, we were a highly unequal society. By the time World War II had ended, we were a middle-class society. and that's the society I grew up in. Society, clearly, with a lot of inequality still, but nothing like the inequality that we had had before. A society in which there were rich people, or certainly there were people who were richer than others. They did not live in a materially different universe. It was a society of relatively shared prosperity. Partially, this was due to taxes, which had become progressive, to the U.S. welfare state, though never as comprehensive as European welfare states, did provide some guarantees, but also to a change in bargaining power within the economy. So we became a society in which labor was a powerful force. Hard to believe this now, but in the 1950s, about a third of U.S. workers were members of unions. So we were a society with a strong labor movement, all of which had the effect of producing a relatively equal society. This happened not through some gradual evolution. It wasn't the case that we were very unequal in 1900 and somewhat more equal in 1925 and then more equal in 1950. It happened abruptly. The economic historians call it the Great Depression. Between about 1935 and 1945, we abruptly became a more equal society, largely because the rise of the labor movement, which finally had a government that was on its side, and the rise of social protections made a huge change in the bargaining power. All right, so we created this society, and for a long time, it persisted. Really, up until the 1970s, we remained this relatively equal society. Then something happened. And if you look at what happened to income inequality, America became, over the course of about 30 years, the country you see now. A country which is once again extremely unequal. A country in which by the numbers, income inequality is about the same as it was in the 1920s. A country in which, I grew up on Long Island, which is a suburb of New York. In the 1920s, the North Shore of Long Island had huge mansions. Actually, both shores of Long Island Sound, the body of water, had the huge mansions of the wealthy. By the time I grew up, those mansions had been, no one could afford. No one had that kind of wealth. No one had servants. So those mansions had become nursing homes, museums, whatever. No, they were not. Private people couldn't afford to live that way. In the 1980s and onwards, the mansions came back. In fact, in Greenwich, Connecticut, which is just the other side of the body of water from where I grew up, many of the Gilded Age mansions were torn down in the last decade to be replaced with bigger mansions for today's wealthy, because we became, again, this enormously unequal society. At the same time, the gap, poverty rose, poverty rates have been flat to rising in the United States. We don't define poverty in relative terms in the United States. We have an absolute definition of the poverty level, and you would think that economic growth would mean that ever fewer people live below the poverty line, but that has not happened. Poverty has increased. Wages for ordinary workers have been adjusted for inflation approximately flat since the 1970s. Where is all the wealth going? It's been going to a few people at the top. Now, what lies behind that? The evidence of the Great Depression suggests that politics has a lot to do with the kind of economy you have. And the rise of inequality in the United States coincided with the growing power of the U.S. political right, with the movement that Barry Goldwater began with his book, The Conscience of a Conservative, acquiring first growing power and eventually complete dominance of U.S. political life. This then translated both into sharp reductions in tax rates at the top, reduction in social programs, but also extreme hostility to labor. The union movement in the United States was largely destroyed as an effective force, at least in the private sector, and it did so not because the industries went away, but because employers felt free to engage in union busting.